Hello and welcome to Partially Redacted, a podcast where we discuss privacy and security engineering and related topics. I'm your host, Sean Faulkner, and today I'm joined by Pramod Raghavendran, Director of Privacy and Data Protection at Coinbase, and we'll be talking about operationalizing a privacy program. Pramod, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Sean. I'm excited to be here.
Yes, awesome. Thanks for joining us. We've been fortunate to have a great variety of experts on the show since we launched back in September. But you're really, I think, the first person we've had on that comes from an engineering background, but has also found their way into privacy. And you've worked as a developer, solutions engineer, technical program manager, engineering manager prior to privacy. Basically, you run the gambit of all engineering roles I think you could have within an organization. But I'd love to hear more about your background, your education, and how you ended up where you are today.
Yeah. Well, to start from the beginning, I was born and grew up in India, where I did my bachelor's in commerce. After that, went to Australia, Melbourne specifically, to do my master's in information technology. It was always a childhood passion of mine to work close to computers, so I guess that was what I was getting there. Fell in love with Australia and stayed there, started my career working as an engineer, grew the ranks, and began to lead organizational-wide engineering projects as well. I typically worked within the insurance wealth management kind of space. Along the way, I'd worked in consulting environments for product companies, for services companies as well. So got that entire plethora of opportunities going too. And then in 2015, one fine evening, I just got a call to say, hey, would you consider working for Amazon in Seattle? I said, yeah, I'm open to a conversation. And then one thing led to the other. And 3 weeks later, I had an opportunity to come across the hemispheres and work in Seattle. The only thing I had to check on was, does it snow in Seattle? I checked that. The answer was rarely, and I was like, okay, I can do this. So I guess that started my journey into some of the big tech companies, Amazon to start with, where advertising was the domain I was operating within, and privacy was the specialization. I was new to both advertising and privacy, but just happened to fall in love with it at the time. It was 2015. GDPR was just about starting to come on the anvil there. And advertising and privacy have a very close connection. Lots happening in that space. So I think the intersection of those two things gave me sufficiently interesting challenges that excited me, that I've made a career out of it. After that, spent about a year in Google. Wanted to learn something new. Google Cloud was my foray into learning that space. And now obviously Coinbase with everything to do with blockchain and crypto. I guess in my mind, privacy is still in its infancy as a body of knowledge. Blockchain, crypto, still very much in its infancy. And at the intersection, lots of problems to solve for. And that's what brought me to Coinbase.
Yeah, it's awesome. I mean, you've really worked across a lot of different types of products that relate to privacy, from advertising, the cloud, to now the work that you're doing at Coinbase. You mentioned this idea that you fell in love with privacy. What was it in particular that kind of made you fall in love with that area?
Yeah, I think to start with, it gives me the opportunity to think about the customer all the time. Ultimately, privacy is solving for the customer. I get to wear that hat. It gets me closer to the customer. And that's what kind of kindled that passion about privacy itself. I'm an end customer for a lot of different products. So that's one specific aspect. And I guess the second is, we're living in an era where data is the new oil, right? There's this data being collected, processed, used across the board, and that's not going to change anytime soon. So as data starts to get collected and get used for new and innovative ways, the constant evolution there in the product lifecycle means that there's so many new challenges to solve for. There's always something new to solve for when it comes to data. And add to that the fact that regulations are evolving constantly. You have a new regulation in every state, country, name it, and it's evolving. And everything is nuanced, slightly different from what previously existed. Products are evolving as well, new ways of using data. Compute and fundamental computing is changing some of the assumptions we made decades ago in terms of what is possible, what is not possible from a compute perspective. So I think the fact that a lot is changing means that privacy gives you a new challenge to solve for almost every day. And that's what keeps me interested every day and wakes me up from bed.
That's awesome. Yeah. I mean, there is a huge, just spectrum. And even, looking back on the people that we've had on the show so far, they come from a huge spectrum of backgrounds as well. And they kind of all bring their own unique perspective, and they're working on their own specific areas of privacy. And it shows how big an evolving space this is. So I think there's probably something that keeps, everybody, interested and engaged if something like privacy piques their interest. So you mentioned this, you started at Amazon, I think in 2015. And you also mentioned about how we're still sort of in the infancy of privacy. But what have you seen change in privacy throughout your career, perhaps both from sort of a technology perspective and maybe also from an operational perspective?
Yeah, I think a lot has changed. And a lot of it has changed for the good. A few perspectives there, right? I'll start with a customer perspective. Data continues to be used and sometimes abused, I'd say, in a lot of enterprises in terms of what happens with the data. But along with that, I think from a customer standpoint, the understanding of privacy or the awareness related to privacy has grown significantly. I would say GDPR played a very key role in raising the profile of privacy across the board, that people at least have awareness. I wouldn't say everyone understands data privacy well enough. We still live in the era of a wall of text being the privacy notice, but ultimately, I think the awareness is there. So that has significantly changed for the better. And I think the other perspective is the regulatory perspective. Regulations are increasing, as we've seen, GDPR, then CCPA, and then now you take any four combination of alphabets and you'll find a regulation almost across the globe there. So the amount of regulation is increasing. But the most important part of that is the penalties that come with these regulations are now so big that privacy has been elevated to a mainstream topic in boardrooms. Right. So I think that elevation of privacy into being front and center of leadership's conversations is a significant change that has happened since the time that I've been involved in privacy. And some of these regulations are iterating quickly to fix gaps in their previous versions. Right. We're seeing California as an example. CCPA came up in a very short span of time. They realized that it had some gaping holes, and now CPRA is coming in with a more consolidated approach to kind of solve for privacy more holistically. So I think that's changing, where regulations are not get it in place, it stays forever, but let's learn from it, let's iterate, and then let's enforce as well. As a result of these external pressures that you see from regulators, from customers, I think organizations are reacting to it as well. And they are evolving how they are responding to privacy. I think in the early days, privacy was more of a legal function or a compliance function. Let's check the boxes, let's have a privacy notice, and we should be good. But things have evolved from there to privacy becoming much closer to engineering and product. In fact, you'll see a lot of investment happening in the privacy engineering space, and you'll see a lot of products emerging in the privacy tech space as well. So I think that evolution has happened over the last 7 to 8 years as well. And finally, as an employee or as a professional working in the privacy space, I think there's been a lot of change there too. Privacy as a career option is a lot more mainstream. You even have university courses now that give you degrees related to privacy engineering, and there's lots of mainstream courses, training material that's available, and privacy engineering is an advertised role type these days. So I think that has come a long way as well from the early days of 2015 when I got involved.
Yeah, and I'd love to see that trend, the educational trend, continue where everybody graduating with a computer science degree at least has some exposure to privacy engineering at some point in their coursework, because I think that will help also address some of the challenges that happen in industry, the push and pull that happens maybe between the privacy engineering organization and the regular software engineering organization. So you mentioned this idea of this growth and awareness of privacy. Do you think that part of that has, privacy very much, personal privacy is very much like a cultural issue. Different cultures think about their own personal privacy in different ways. And I think one of the things that's unique over the last, decade or so is we have these huge global companies now that aren't just addressing people in, the country of origin where they started, like in the United States, but now they're operating all over the world. And the fact that they're now touching people all over the world, collecting data about people all over the world where different citizens will have different sort of cultural aspect of thinking about their own personal privacy. Has that forced essentially this growth in regulation as well as this growth of awareness and privacy? Do you think there's some connection there?
Yeah, I think there is a connection. There always is. Whether that's a direct connection or not, I think is debatable, right? If you really think about it, the fact that cultural differences exist has resulted in how certain products, features, or changes have been consumed by customers, right? A classic example is WhatsApp. When they changed their privacy notice, India, which is where I originally come from, there was a lot of bad press about the fact that WhatsApp was now going to deal with data in ways that are detrimental to end customers. A lot of it was not well founded because it was just hearsay and a lot of propaganda going around. But culturally, that's what became the norm. People started to believe that WhatsApp was doing all these wrong things, to the extent that at the time, Facebook had to come in, launch a huge campaign in terms of starting to rebuild that trust, rebuild the messaging around what actually is happening in WhatsApp, what is not happening in WhatsApp. So I think cultural differences definitely have raised awareness overall, sometimes for the better, sometimes to the detriment as well. But I think in the end, it started to spin its wheels, right? It'll start to get better. Knowledge will grow. Understanding of privacy will improve over a period of time as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great. And then, you meant because of this, growth and awareness, and then of course the, ever-changing regulatory landscape, have you seen a trend for companies to start focusing on privacy earlier in their life cycle than maybe you previously encountered?
Yes. A lot of companies typically still, even today, tend to be very reactive when it comes to privacy, but there's that ever so slight shift towards the left, if you will, that's happening, right? So if you take CCPA as an example, perhaps an average company would have started looking at it 3 months before it came into effect. But now with CPRA, chances are they're looking at it 6 months before it came into effect. So I think organizations are definitely starting to take credence a little bit earlier in the life cycle of when they need to react and respond. Internally as well, in terms of their processes, because these regulations are kind of coming in almost every 6 months, there's something or the other coming in, they've ingrained that into their product development life cycles to start thinking about privacy earlier in the cycle than as an afterthought. So both of those things are happening, but I still feel like a large percentage of organizations are still solving for privacy as a compliance consideration. Check a box, right? I've been asked by these regulations to do X, Y, and Z. I'm going to do X, Y, and Z in the most efficient manner. Check, 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 done. I still feel like there's a huge amount of growth for organizations to do to move beyond privacy being a compliance consideration and thinking about it as a product differentiator or a customer trust consideration.
Yeah. So how do we get out of this mindset of treating privacy like as a compliance issue or something that needs to be checked off on some sort of checklist?
Yeah, I think it's a cultural mindset shift that needs to be driven internally, right? there still remains a fallacy within a lot of organizations that privacy is owned by the team that sits in the corner labeled as the privacy team, right? Unfortunately, that's not the case. Privacy is a shared responsibility of everybody in the organization. In fact, I'd argue that product and engineering teams own more of the privacy than any other team because they're the ones closest to the customer. They're the ones closest to the data that is being collected and processed. So I think ingraining that culture in terms of bringing that shared understanding of privacy across the organization is the first step towards starting to get them to think about privacy beyond just regulations. You take a regulation and expectations of a regulation to an engineer, they're like, no, I want to think about this from a customer and a technology standpoint, right? So, and they're able to think about it from a technology and a customer standpoint only if they understand the foundations of privacy. What does trust mean? How does data use hamper customers' privacy? What are some of their rights? How should we think about what control choice mechanisms that customers should have? So I think education and building culture within the organization is the first step towards starting to think about privacy more as a differentiator or a trust consideration.
Mm-hmm. And then, for newer companies that, perhaps a startup that needs to start a privacy program, who should they be looking to hire? Because obviously there's a lot of, characteristics and skills that go into being a great privacy leader, building and operationalizing a privacy program from scratch. But also you might have to come in and kind of teach the culture of privacy to the company as well. So that's a really unique set of skills.
Yeah. A lot of organizations still kind of initiate their privacy function within the legal function. I'm a strong believer that that's not the right way, especially for a startup to begin solving for privacy. I think establishing this function closer to the product and engineering is going to give you a lot of payback in the short term as well as the long term. For the reasons that we just talked about, right? Closest to the customer, that's where a lot of the data is being dealt with. So that is where I would look for skills in the privacy product intersection space. Specific skills for a privacy leader, I think somebody who's an expert in the privacy domain for sure has that understanding of strong privacy fundamentals is completely essential. They should be a very strong technology practitioner as well. I think privacy is at its core is in data, how data transits, how data is used. So understanding the technological aspects of that is going to be super important. I think they need to be extremely strong at communication. If you really think about a privacy function, it sits in the middle, surrounded by a bunch of very diverse set of stakeholders. Product and engineering on the one side, but you've got marketing, you've got biz dev, you've got public relations, you've got legal, who understand less of the technology and the product aspects, right? So you're sitting in the middle there, translating conversations between these disparate groups of stakeholders. So being a very effective and strong communicator is going to be super important. And finally, I think privacy outcomes are less science and a lot of art as well. Regulations, if you notice, they're very framework based. You need to interpret it, you need to apply it. There's a lot of judgment involved. So a privacy leader would need to be somebody that comes with a good judgment, high judgment individual that can then make some of the tough decisions, have good trade-off conversations with the business to be able to land on what's the right thing from a customer standpoint and from an organization standpoint.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and imagine you mentioned, being a good technology practitioner. That's probably really helpful if you're sitting, sort of in the product and engineering organization, so that you can build trust, have in-depth conversations with those people. But then, as you mentioned, you also have to be a really strong communicator so that you can have these cross-functional communications with the other functional areas of the company. And something that we've talked about previously on the show is the idea that something like privacy is touches every facet of the business. It's not a feature. It's not, sole owner. It needs to be part of the cultural identity of the company to do it really well. And that means everybody needs to understand the importance of it and kind of be understanding the vision of it and why we need to, be privacy champions and kind of be shifting that things to the left when it comes to, design of products and other types of investments we might be making as an organization.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that's essentially it. Getting into the culture, bringing privacy into the ethos of the organizational thinking is going to be essential. So any privacy leader should think of that about that as their primary responsibility.
Sorry for the interruption, folks, but I just had a few quick reminders. If you're enjoying this episode, please hit the subscribe button so you can always get the latest episode. And help others discover the show by leaving a rating and review in your favorite podcast app. It really helps. Last thing, before I get you back to the interview, if you are interested in the topics discussed in this podcast, then you should definitely join the Partially Redacted community at skyflow.com/community. There, you can meet other interesting and like-minded individuals like yourself, share your expertise, or just passively engage, totally up to you. All right, now back to the show. So if you were, joining a new company today to essentially build their privacy program, what's your first, 30 days look like?
Well, I think there's obviously going to be the cliched things that you would do in any new job, which is start to build your relationship, start to understand the product, and those sorts of things. But if you talk about specifically from a privacy standpoint, I think the single most important thing that I've found out is calibrating yourself to how the organization is thinking about privacy. I'll lay out a spectrum, right? This is a spectrum that I think exists within organizations, either inherently or just an understood spectrum. On the one end is organizations that don't care about privacy. They think of it as a bare minimum, put a privacy policy up, boom, be done with it. And as you shift on that spectrum, the next is organizations that think about privacy as a compliance requirement. We'll do everything that we need to comply, we'll check a box and call it done. And other organizations that are further along that maturity curve elevate beyond compliance and start to think about customer trust. Yes, I'm going to be required to do things by certain regulations, but how should I think about privacy from a customer standpoint? How should I solve on behalf of the customer to make sure we are earning their trust, retaining their trust, we are managing their reasonable expectations? And finally, the most mature organizations are perhaps the ones on the other end of that spectrum where they're thinking about product differentiation or even advocacy. For that matter, right? To go and bring about change in the industry in terms of how we think privacy should be handled, how trust should be handled, is the other end of that spectrum. So as a privacy leader, in the first 30 days, I think it's super important to figure out where an organization is along that spectrum. And more importantly, where does the organization want to go in the near term, medium term, and long term, because that essentially gives the privacy leader the compass in terms of where to focus energies on, how to invest your team's bandwidth on, and how to think about solving for that problem.
It's probably really important to have those conversations as part of the interview process too, as you're, if you're thinking about joining an organization, making sure that the leaders of that organization are aligned philosophically with your views on privacy and where you want to take, that program as well, I imagine.
Yes, absolutely. I think interviews do give you a bunch of that intel, but a lot of that can be the sales speak, if you will, as well. So going in the first 30 days, getting a real first-hand take of where things are at, understanding who within the organization are allies from a privacy standpoint, how do you navigate yourself, and then that gives you a lot of inputs in terms of how you want to establish your program, where do you want to focus first, and then kind of get going, operationalizing that program.
Yeah, and you mentioned the idea, I think, of the really sort of visionary companies are the ones that are the leaders in the space, thinking of, privacy as a product differentiator. So do you think, is that the direction that a lot of companies should be thinking about, is they should be prioritizing privacy, not only because it's the right thing to do, but also it's a way to differentiate your product offering from other people?
Yeah, I don't think product differentiation from a privacy standpoint is for everybody, right? Because it comes at a cost. It comes at a huge amount of investment as well. So yes, absolutely. I think product differentiation is definitely worthy to aim for, but it depends on where an organization is, what they want to achieve as well. If you take an example, if there's a startup coming up in the healthcare space, privacy becomes table stakes at that stage, right? It's super important from day zero that you need to have a high bar for privacy. Whereas if you have a variety of other services where perhaps personal data is a minuscule of what you deal with, privacy is not so important. So privacy differentiation need not be a goal that you need to achieve. So I think you need to calibrate based on the problem space you're operating in, the domain you're operating in, and the organizational where is the organization right at that time from a maturity standpoint. But if you really think about it, privacy becoming more mainstream has led to some very positive outcomes. Every vendor RFI or RFP asks privacy questions. How do you deal with privacy? Have you had a breach in the recent past? Do you have a privacy function? How many people are in that privacy function? So privacy is definitely a differentiator. It is a point of decision that a lot of enterprises make. That is an important aspect. We've seen the big examples of Apple, right? Apple has huge billboards in Vegas talking about privacies from time to time. They have pivoted the industry, especially in the advertising space and the app store space, to kind of be completely based on privacy. They talk about processing data on the device and not taking it to the server side, and that's differentiation from a privacy standpoint. So their marketing message is very much oriented around privacy, right? As one of the pillars of their overall product. So we've seen examples like that. There are other emerging examples as well. In the browser space, obviously there's adoption with the Chromes and the Safaris of the world. But if you look at Brave, it's a browser that's come up fundamentally to solve for privacy. It wants to keep customers' data more private, but while enabling the rich web experiences that we are so used to these days. Search is another example, right? Google uses a lot of the search data for ads, but Neeva is a startup that has sprung up to provide a subscription-based search service where privacy is their fundamental promise. Right, so you're starting to see, still in its infancy, a lot of products emerge where privacy is being thought of as the fundamental differentiator, and I think we'll see a lot more of this happen increasingly in the coming decade or so.
Yeah, and of course, there's a lot of this development as well in like the messaging space in both peer-to-peer and business to consumer messaging. So, what does it mean to operationalize a privacy program, and how do you go about actually operationalizing a company's privacy program?
Well, I think any program, when you need to operationalize it, broadly has three facets to it, right? It's the people, the process, and the technology that comes with it. So I guess just focusing on those three things are going to be super important. But the privacy specific things, I think every privacy program needs to operate in two modes. One is a reactive mode and the other is a proactive mode. The reactive mode is you have little or no notice about what's coming your way, but you need to respond to it. For example, Apple launched their ATT tracking restrictions. Companies had 3 months to go and conform with it initially. Nobody knew that Apple was going to do something like that and implement it a particular way. You need to react to it. In other instances, you got to be proactive. This is where the more mature organizations are thinking about trust. They're thinking about how their organization is processing data, getting a data map together, etc. So I think needing to solve for both the reactive and proactive aspects is going to be important to operationalizing a program. If we take an instance where an organization does not have a privacy program, and if I was tasked to instantiate one there, I would primarily focus on the reactive side of things because that's the more existential side of things. Establish that reactive function, your ability to react to stimuli, new regulation, change, a product team wanting to do something new and wanting guidance from a privacy standpoint. So privacy assessments as a core mechanism, as a core process, as a core function, set that up. Incident management, right? incidents can happen anytime. So what happens if an incident happens? How do you detect? How do you respond? And then how do you remedy incidents? So these are some of the fundamental things I would initially set up from an operationalization perspective. That's going to do two things. One is it's going to stop the bleeding within the organization, because you're starting to build some walls around the organization in terms of what can go wrong. The second thing, and the more important thing it's going to do, is give you a lot of intel in terms of what is the lay of the land within the organization. How is privacy being dealt with? Where are some of the hotspots for privacy? And that allows you to decide on some of the proactive investments that you can make over a period of time. So then I would go into establishing some of the proactive functions, which kind of starts with building a data map. Build a catalog of what data is being processed. How is that data classified? What type of data is it? What is it used for? How does data transition across the enterprise? And how does it leave the enterprise to third-party vendor solutions? How does data come in from vendor solutions? Just understanding that end-to-end view, because that's going to be a foundational piece to be able to react. So let's build that proactively. Let's get that foundational understanding in there. And then as you continue to mature the program, that's when I would, excuse me, that's when I would start to think about some of the more mature aspects of operationalizing a program, which is bringing engineering considerations into the place. How can we start introducing engineering from a variety of perspectives, right? Engineering could deal with a lot of frameworks that you build, primitive services where privacy is available out of the box, so that engineers can just adopt and then get privacy out of the box for a lot of the stuff that they work with. It could also be building compliance tooling, which helps you detect, prevent, and respond to violations, both to regulations or to internal policies, or just to organizational considerations in terms of how you don't want to do bad things with data. So investing in engineering solutions would be the next step that I would embark on as I continue to operationalize and mature a privacy program. Finally, obviously, there's a strategic aspect to it as well. How can privacy have a seat at the table when product vision or organizational vision is being established, right? How do you think about advocacy efforts in the industry? How do you start going out there and creating differentiation in the industry based on what you do? So these are some of the really more mature stuff that you'd get to towards the end, after you've done some of the other steps, the reactiveness, the proactiveness, and the engineering aspects of it.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. That was an amazing response. Going back to what you talked about at the beginning, this idea of initially investing in building out the reactive function, is that going to be a different set of hires than maybe is part of the proactive function, or are these going to be eventually sort of the same type of people that are maybe doing both functional areas?
I think anybody in a privacy role would basically have three strong areas of skills. They are the privacy skills, which is core and important to operating in privacy. There are program skills, and then there's technical skills. I think any role in privacy is just going to be a different mix of these three skills. So when it comes to privacy assessments, these teams typically work very closely with product and engineering teams. So with a strong privacy background, I'd expect that they have a strong technology suite as well. The understanding of technology to be much higher when they're working in a reactive space. When you're working in a proactive space, you sometimes have the ability to bring in some alternate skills, people coming in from the risk perspective, people coming in from the compliance perspective. So they bring that program aspect to their skill set, perhaps a little less of the technology perspective, because you can lean on engineers, you can lean on your reactive teams to kind of operate in that space there. So I think ultimately it's those three core skills, but you need to find a right balance so that you have you have complementary skills within the overall privacy function itself.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned also the introduction of engineering solutions and the idea of eventually privacy being part of sort of the product vision stage. So how do you go about making privacy a design consideration so that companies adopt sort of the shift left process for privacy? Yeah.
I'd go back to culture, right? I think embedding privacy as part of the culture within an organization is going to make it so much easier to become front and center of everybody's day-to-day work, right? You want your product manager who's deciding, who's defining the next product or the next feature to be aware of and think about privacy. You want your engineer who's going to build the next data pipeline to be aware of privacy. And the only way to do that is to embed privacy within the culture. Training is a super important aspect of achieving that cultural change. What I have done in the past, and I continue to do, is everywhere I establish a privacy function, the first thing I do is set up a mission for the organization, set up a set of principles. Once these are done, it's about doing a roadshow, going to all the product and engineering teams, walking them through what that means, why is that important, and how are we operationalizing some of those principles, and how are we achieving those missions, that mission. It also is about educating them about the support that they have from my team as a privacy operational team, from the privacy legal teams in terms of getting their privacy outcomes understood and delivered. The moment you do some of these fundamental things, it starts to bring alignment across the organization. Everyone's thinking about, okay, I have a privacy mission. I don't want to be the one that's left out of that mission, right? I want to be in line with the privacy principles of the organization. That starts to spin the wheels in terms of getting privacy front and center of conversations. I think once that happens, that shift left automatically kind of begins. It's not enough to stop at that. With that, I think you need to mature your privacy operation to be able to support that shift left as well. When you have shift left, the type of ambiguity you deal with much earlier in the phase is going to be much higher. So your mechanisms, your processes, your tools need to be able to deal with that ambiguity. Some of the decision making is also a lot more ambiguous. The trade-offs are very different when you make some decisions much early on. So super different. So maturing the program to be able to deal with some of those introduced ambiguities because of thinking about privacy much earlier have to come along as well. If those don't come along, the fact that culture and people are thinking about privacy will fall flat. So I think it's going to be that partnership between product and engineering teams and the privacy operations team, both working in concert to kind of shift things left, that's going to be important. So in summary, I'd say culture, training, and then focus on the mechanisms and the frameworks to be able to deal with privacy as you continue to shift left.
Yeah, and imagine, the combination of developing this mission, doing the road show, bringing in product and engineering sort of into the process and making them align on it also helps navigate the potential challenges that you might have with the privacy program, where engineering and product kind of see it as a blocker for them to do their job versus something that's actually value add.
Absolutely. Yes. I think that's well put. That's an important part of shifting left in an organization.
So as a company scales and everything is kind of moving really fast, and I'm sure this is very true at a lot of fast-moving startups, how does you go about ensuring that privacy isn't something that kind of gets pushed aside in favor for shipping the product quickly?
Yeah, I think having a seat at the table is super important, especially when it comes to product conversations, engineering conversations. So I would make sure that privacy as a function is organizationally closely aligned with product and engineering, if not reporting through product and engineering. That's the first step, right? The moment you do that, it's the same leaders in the organization that are responsible for product outcomes, engineering outcomes, that are also responsible for privacy outcomes. The moment you align those two things together, the chances are you'll always think about privacy as part of your product and engineering outcomes as well. So I think that's one way to do it, where you have the ability to establish that privacy operations program closer to the product and engineering organizations. The other thing to do is to invest in engineering. privacy in a lot of organizations is still looked at as a tax, right? Privacy teams, security teams, historically, they're looked at as the office of no. They're looked at as blockers. So I think changing that culture is super important. And the way you can change that is through making smart investments. How do you build privacy into the framework? How do you build primitive services that give you privacy out of the box? In fact, if you look around today, there aren't too many solutions or products that operate in some of the privacy primitives. You talk about data localization. You talk about identity solutions. Great to see Skyflow operating in that PII vault space, right? Which is an emerging space to kind of solve for. Anonymization, pseudonymization are fundamental things that there aren't reusable tools that can just be deployed and you can achieve outcomes there. Dealing with sensitive data, location data, don't have primitives there. There's a lot that could be done there as well. So I think thinking about these investments and investing in engineering solutions in these areas is going to help product and engineering teams see privacy as less of a blocker and more of a partner, where engineers continue to be able to focus on delivering value to customers without having to worry about some of the baseline privacy considerations. So I think that's a couple of things that I would do to make sure that privacy remains front and center in organizations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think, we've talked about this before on the program. Like, I think for most engineers and product leaders, they do care about, privacy and security, and they want to do the right thing. They just don't always know how to do that. And they don't always have, like you mentioned, the tools at their disposal to actually even do those things. Or they might be sort of unaware of the things that they should be doing.
Yeah. Absolutely. I think empowering your product and engineering teams is going to be pillar number one for privacy operations program.
Mm-hmm. And then how do you go about scaling a privacy program as a company scales?
Interestingly, I've had to do this in multiple organizations. Every organization is unique in their way to scale, right? But I think if I were to talk about a formula to scale, there's a couple of things that I would think about. The first is invest in engineering. Engineering is the only way to ensure that you're scaling privacy from multiple dimensions. The first thing is you're scaling it from an automation perspective, because you're getting things out of the box, which means your compliance burden is going to reduce because you're getting a lot of things out of the box. The second thing is you're scaling because your growing engineering and product teams don't need to focus a large percentage of their time on plumbing and privacy fundamentals. What they're focusing on is adding value to customers and the fringe privacy things that really require dedicated solutions. And the third is automation makes sure that privacy programs don't have to grow linearly with product and engineering, which is often a big pain point in organizations when funding becomes a question, right? So finding mechanisms to sublinearly scale along with your broader organization is super important to the long-term success of your privacy program. Having invested in engineering, the other thing I would do is focus your operations part of the program on two dimensions. One is jurisdictional. We see a lot of emerging privacy regulations across the globe, right? EU, UK is coming up with its own GDPR, and then you've got APAC, where Japan, Singapore, Australia, India, they all have either privacy regulations in place that are evolving or emerging privacy regulations. The Americas have their own as well. So specializing on the jurisdictional dimension is important, so you can provide specialized support, you can provide localized support to teams within there, and you can optimize to work on behalf of the customers within those locales. You can understand benchmarking, you can understand the regulators better, and you can also think about cultural differences that we spoke about earlier on the program, right? So I think that jurisdictional angle is super important. And the other dimension is the product dimension. Solving for privacy is at the center of data and its intersection with the product or the domain that you're looking to use that data for. So having that deep product domain knowledge is also going to be very important. As organizations grow, typically they become multi-product organizations, or even if it's a single product organization, the product footprint is so large that there are different areas of specialization with different privacy considerations. So scaling a team based on products-based specialization is the other dimension. What this jurisdictional and product wide setup is going to give you is your ability to scale, again, sublinearly, where the two can form a mesh and solve for privacy globally. So when product A needs to launch in 5 countries, you've got a product privacy leader and you've got 2 or 3 jurisdictional leaders that can work in consort to go and solve for it. If there's a new regulation in a particular jurisdiction, that jurisdictional leader can work with each of the product privacy leaders to solve for compliance there across the products. So it gives you a really good lever through which you can scale your program elastically through various demands and needs as things evolve within the organization. That's how I would scale a privacy function.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. I love what you talked about at the beginning, the idea of investing in the engineering of the organization. I think if you empower engineers to, solve complex problems using engineering, they have a track record of being very successful, being very motivated and innovative in that space. So I think if we can bring privacy, data privacy, data security, and approach it like an engineering problem, there's a lot of really, really innovative things that we can do to help address some of those problems from a fundamental level. And then I really like what you mentioned about jurisdictional expertise. I think that's really, really important. You need sort of the diversity aspect of a privacy program so that you can take into account the different cultural aspects, as well as just it's a big changing landscape out there, and every country now is coming forth with their own rules and regulations and a lot to try to navigate and have global expertise on. You really need sort of the regional level expertise as well.
Yep.
So what are sort of the typical roles and responsibilities of a privacy program?
Well, a traditional privacy program, which is focused on risk management. Ultimately, there is risks that you need to manage. So risk management is an important part of it. Compliance, perhaps the other side of the coin to risk, is an important part of a successful privacy program. But I think more importantly, a privacy program needs to work with the product and engineering teams to maximize the business output while staying on the side of customer trust and compliant with privacy regulations. So it's that function that privacy teams perform. We are enablers. We should be enablers, enabling the business to do what they are setting out to do while doing it in a compliant and risk-free manner, building trust, retaining trust as well. To be able to do that, I think there are some skills that are typically required as part of the daily roles and responsibilities. And that is being able to communicate through the diverse set of stakeholders that we work with. Understanding product and working with product, understanding what their drivers are, understanding engineering solutions and technology, understanding PR ramifications, right? Working with your public relations team in terms of what is a good message and what is a bad message to avoid. Working with your marketing teams, how do you want to position this product? So I think just being able to communicate really effectively complex and ambiguous privacy considerations with this diverse set of groups, I think is a key responsibility for any privacy operations program.
Mm-hmm. And, as we start to kind of wrap up here, where do you see privacy engineering going in the next 5 to 10 years?
I think privacy engineering will become more mainstream in a variety of different ways, right? Within organizations, I think privacy will start to become solved fundamentally through engineering. The rate at which new regulations are coming, the differences within these regulations is just not going to be scalable to deal with it just through operations, right? And through adding people to solving these problems. So I think engineering will become increasingly relied upon to achieve privacy outcomes within organizations. And as that happens, there's an interesting thing that also happens, right? There's a lot of patterns to solve for some of these very problems. So I can see a lot of privacy products start to spring up. We already have a few, but I'd expect that there'll be a lot more in that space. I think in that space today, the industry is flooded with compliance type privacy solutions, which come in after the fact. They allow you to data map, allow you to classify data, allow you to enforce policies, etc. But I still see there's a dearth in the primitives that I talked about, right? Privacy primitives that you can use to bootstrap your technical stack so that you get a lot of privacy foundational elements out of the box for free is an area where I think a lot of the technology industry will gravitate towards, where engineering solutions will start to become more mainstream in the privacy space.
Yeah, absolutely, and I really aligned with I think your vision of where you want to see privacy engineering to go in the next 5 to 10 years. Is there anything else you'd like to share?
I think if there's one thought I'd like to leave everyone here, especially the engineering community, right? Engineers are typically builders. They like to build things and see things work. Whereas solving for privacy requires a little bit of an adversarial mindset. The importance of every privacy program is to make sure that you don't break the engineer's builder's mindset while solving for privacy. So as you think about engineering solutions, as you think about operational mechanisms, processes to support engineering teams, always bear in mind that you don't want to break the builder's mindset that engineers carry by default. So I think that's one thought that I just believe in a lot, and I thought others would benefit from hearing it as well.
Excellent. Yeah, I think that's a great place to leave it. Pramod, thanks so much for coming on the show. Hopefully we can do this again down the road. I feel like there's probably a ton of different topics that you would have great insights into. But thanks again and cheers.
Thank you so much. I enjoyed being here.